Hello everybody! Welcome back to my channel Eclectic Reads. Oftentimes, I find myself reading books that are very similar in topic. Unintentionally, I will start with one book and then something in that book will prompt me to read a book on a similar topic. So I am starting this series called Bookish Cousins, about books that are not written by the same author or in the same series, but are dealing with similar topics. The two books I am talking about today are Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner and Encounters with the Archdruid by John McPhee. Both are fairly old nonfiction books. They are at least 30 years old. I started with Cadillac Desert, a book that I had picked up the spur of the moment at a used bookstore around here. And it's funny because the person who used to own this book was also named Mark. This is not the author. So I just thought that was pretty funny. But you can see it is quite an old book. Cadillac Desert was first published in 1986, and this edition is from 1993. Cadillac Desert tells the story of the West through water and through the various public works, particularly dams, that have been established to help both small farmers and large farmers reclaim water in a region where there is very little water, and to generate power. At the heart of this book is a conflict that emerges between two federal agencies. The first is the Bureau of Reclamation, and Mark Reisner has a lot to say about this agency. They were established to help farmers reclaim water, and dam building became one of the ways in which they were able to do that, particularly in California. Mark Reisner has a lot of issues with California, and I have always kind of been indifferent to the state, but now that I live in southern Arizona, and after reading this book, I too am feeling very frustrated with California, particularly Los Angeles, that took our water, a lot of it, and continues to do so. So that was an interesting moment in this book. The second agency is the US Army Corps of Engineers. They build dams, but for a different reason. Their focus is on maintaining the integrity of the land so that people's houses aren't flooded. So it's about water management and flood control rather than helping farmers irrigate their fields. This is a very juicy book at times, especially when it talks about Owens Valley, which was this region in California that had its water stolen by Los Angeles, by some bureaucrats, with the help, of course, of the Bureau of Reclamation. One of the more interesting figures in this book is Floyd Dominy, who was the head of the Bureau of Reclamation for many, many years, and somebody who really believed that any drop of water that ended up in the ocean was wasted water. He believed in using the environment to its absolute maximum. And he then ended up getting into conflict with an environmentalist named Dave Brower. Brower was the head of the Sierra Club, and he protested every dam, basically. But because of his protests, the Grand Canyon doesn't have any dams. He was, however, unable to prevent Glen Canyon Dam from being established, and the result of that was Lake Powell. I've never visited Lake Powell. I'm not from Arizona, but I've been living here for a few years, and I am interested in visiting Lake Powell just because I have students who do. Dave Brower was a very polarizing figure because he was a staunch environmentalist who sometimes fudged the data to support his cause. He did a lot of good work, but was ultimately pushed out of the Sierra Club by board members who felt like he was taking the club in a direction that they didn't want, and also that he was being reckless with the money he was spending. Cadillac Desert doesn't talk a lot about that. There's a little bit of that in the next book I'll be talking about. There are other events discussed in this book. For example, the breaking of the St. Francis Dam, which led to deaths and just destruction. This was a dam that should never have been built, but the arrogance of the Bureau of Reclamation led to this and to the failure of the dam. I particularly loved Mark Reisner's sense of humor in this book. This is a topic that could be very dry, but he finds a way to bring these characters to life, especially Floyd Dominy. He is sort of this symbol of like the rugged individualist American who like has no concern for the environment and it's all about himself and how awesome he is. He is quite a character. And if you're interested, YouTube has parts of actually the entire documentary of Cadillac Desert, which came out, I think, in the late 90s. And that one includes interviews with Floyd Dominy as well as with Mark Reisner and David Brower. I definitely recommend the documentary, although the version that's on YouTube, there's like damaged sections and the quality isn't fantastic, but it's definitely good to watch after reading this book. I would say its only weakness is the end. I would say the last like 50 or 100 pages definitely dragged, especially when it got into like the details of like the politics. It got a little bit slow, and I think that this book could have been about 100 pages shorter. But I did notice when I was at Barnes and Noble recently that a new edition of this has come out. It was on the new bookshelf. So I definitely think it's a worthy read, especially if you don't know anything about the history of dams in the United States. There are dams that absolutely are not providing any value, and then there are dams like the Hoover Dam that are very, very important. So it's a mixed history, and I really enjoyed it. I started reading nonfiction again after picking this up. Then I decided to check out from the library Encounters with the Archdruid by John McPhee. This book was published earlier than Cadillac Desert. This was actually published in 1971, I think. But it was mentioned in Cadillac Desert, so while I was reading it, I was like, I want to read this next. This is an interesting form of nonfiction. So in this book, John McPhee has 3 separate encounters with David Brower, the environmentalist, and with 3 of his enemies. The word Archdruid here is the name that a real estate developer named Charles Fraser called people like David Brower, who were what he thinks are preservationists. Like they wanted to keep environments just pristine, but like not providing any kind of value to humans. He feels like they're just druids, and that the archdruid is David Brower because he was the head of the Sierra Club. There are 3 different men here who oppose David Brower. The first is Charles Park, the mineral engineer who wanted to mine copper in Glacial Peak in California. The second is Charles Fraser, the real estate developer who wanted to build some real estate on Cumberland Island, which is a part of the state of Georgia. And then the final one is Floyd Dominy. I will say the section on Floyd Dominy was the weakest because there wasn't really anything there that I didn't know. And I also felt like the interactions between the 2 men weren't interesting. They didn't raise any kind of new questions. I felt like they were such polar opposites. Whereas the first section with Charles Park was probably my favorite section because Charles Park, being a mineral engineer, talks to Brower a lot about how everything we use includes copper, and that copper mining is therefore necessary for people to maintain their same quality of life, and the technologies that in the 70s were already quite advanced, and of course today are even more advanced. And so he was telling Brower, he's like, I know you're saying this is going to destroy the mountain, but people want this, and you're going to tell them that they can't have it because you don't want to be mining copper. I also found this interesting because Charles Park himself probably knows the flora and fauna better than Brower. He was able to name all the flowers and the insects and the plants, and he knew the minerals. Like he knew so much, and so I could really admire that. But I also started to think about the fact that so often we place the onus on the consumer to be sustainable, when in fact the demand for these things was created artificially by companies through publicity, which is a topic I'll be talking about in a future video. Stay tuned for that. Take like the iPhone, for example. People didn't ask for an iPhone. Sure, it's a really great piece of technology. It's one that we all own and is seen as a necessity, but it's not like we demanded Apple create the iPhone. But once it was created, then suddenly it becomes this necessity. If there were more restrictions placed on companies with environmentalism as a concern, these things wouldn't even be created in the first place, and therefore there wouldn't be as much demand on the planet to provide the minerals and the labor and all of that. So it was an interesting conversation. I kind of sympathized with Charles Park, but I also had to think about who is really to blame for the destruction of the planet. Charles Fraser was interesting as well. I think he and David Brower got along fairly well. And I just love that this author John McPhee used these encounters as a way to open up a conversation about the environment and about how we should or should not use the environment, or what role public projects or private projects play. It was also just such a beautiful form of environmental writing. There's just so many beautiful scenes in this book. I will say, this book having been written in 1971, the cost of living, or just what things cost, was so different. So you could rent an apartment for $200 to $300, which made me laugh. Or the fact that the most expensive houses were like $300,000-$400,000, which is what a house costs today, at least where I live. That's like average price. There are other books that John McPhee has written that also deal with the environment to some extent, so I do look forward to reading more by him. So these are the two in this video: Cadillac Desert and Encounters with the Archdruid. Let me know if there are books that you have read that would fit within this category. I would be happy to read further about water and about the way that water has been managed or mismanaged, as well as just questions revolving around the environment and our duty to the environment, but also how we can use the environment. What are the limitations to that? Let me know in the comments. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.